The secret matchmaker nobody knew about for years. Swifties have tried to piece together the exact moment Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce became more than two famous people orbiting the same world. Was it the friendship bracelet? Was it Travis talking about Taylor on his podcast? Was it the first private conversation nobody saw? Was it the first date? Or was there someone behind the scenes quietly pushing the two of them toward each other before either one fully understood where the story was going? Now, we have a much clearer answer. And surprisingly, it wasn't Taylor. It wasn't Travis. It wasn't a celebrity friend. It wasn't one of Taylor's famous girlfriends. It was her mom, Andrea Swift. The woman who has been beside Taylor through childhood dreams, career explosions, stadium tours, heartbreaks, controversies, triumphs, and some of the most important chapters of her life. And according to the story Taylor and Andrea themselves shared, Andrea didn't simply hear about Travis Kelce and casually think he seemed nice. She investigated him. She asked about him. She found out what kind of person he was. And then she basically went to Taylor and said, "You need to give this guy a chance." Think about that for a second. Because when Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce eventually became one of the most talked about couples on the planet, millions of people assumed their story began with Travis making a bold public gesture. But behind that very public moment was a much quieter conversation happening inside Taylor's family. A mother watching the headlines. A daughter who wasn't necessarily interested. A football player trying to get her attention. And one very important detail that apparently made Andrea Swift's ears perk up immediately: Travis Kelce loved his mom. That was the green flag. And now, knowing how the story eventually turned out, that tiny detail feels almost unbelievable. Because this wasn't just a mother saying, "Hey, he's cute." This was Andrea Swift noticing something about Travis that mattered to her. Family. Character. The way he treated the people closest to him. And perhaps most importantly, the fact that his interest in Taylor didn't begin with some carefully manufactured celebrity strategy. It began with a friendship bracelet. A football player at a Taylor Swift concert. A failed attempt to meet her. And a story that somehow went from an awkward missed connection to a relationship that would eventually change both of their lives. So how did Andrea get involved? Why was Taylor initially hesitant? And how much of the relationship that Swifties watched unfold was actually set in motion before the public even knew Taylor and Travis were talking? That's where this story gets fascinating. Because Taylor's mother may have been one of the earliest people in Taylor's world to realize that Travis wasn't simply another celebrity trying to get close to her daughter. He might actually be different. And today, that revelation hits even harder. Because this isn't a relationship that simply disappeared after a few months of headlines. It grew. It survived extraordinary public attention. It became part of Taylor's life during the final stretch of the Eras tour. And eventually, it led to marriage. So before we go any further, if you followed Taylor through every era and you love discovering the stories behind the headlines, subscribe to Taylor Timeline. Because sometimes the most important part of Taylor Swift's story isn't the moment the world sees. It's the conversation that happened before the cameras arrived. And in this case, that conversation apparently began with her mom. The friendship bracelet that started everything. To understand why Andrea Swift became involved, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to 2023. Taylor Swift was in the middle of the Eras tour, a tour that was already becoming something much larger than a traditional concert tour. Every city had become an event. Every outfit became a discussion. Every surprise song became a headline. Every celebrity appearance could become a viral moment. And Travis Kelce was watching. The Kansas City Chiefs star had attended Taylor's concert in Kansas City. And he had a plan. A friendship bracelet. Except there was one problem. He didn't get to meet her. Travis later explained that he had wanted to give Taylor a friendship bracelet with his phone number on it. It didn't happen. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. You tried. It didn't work. Move on. But Travis didn't exactly move on. Instead, he talked about the experience publicly on his podcast. And suddenly, the story reached Taylor's world. That was the moment the entire trajectory of their relationship began to shift. Because somewhere in the Swift household, Andrea Swift saw the headlines. And she became curious. Not obsessed. Not dramatic. Curious. Who was this guy? Why was he trying to meet Taylor? What was his deal? And instead of simply searching his name and moving on, Andrea did something that makes perfect sense when you understand the role she has played in Taylor's life. She asked someone she trusted. In the documentary conversation, Andrea explained that she called her cousin Robin, whom she described as her resident expert on the Kansas City Chiefs. And Andrea's question was simple. Tell me about Travis Kelce. Now, imagine being Robin in that moment. Your cousin calls you because Taylor Swift has been approached by a Kansas City Chiefs superstar, and Andrea Swift wants to know whether this guy is worth taking seriously. That's not exactly an ordinary family conversation. And Robin apparently had a very strong answer. She told Andrea that Travis was a nice guy. But then came the detail that really caught Andrea's attention. He really loves his mom. Andrea's reaction was essentially immediate. Ding, ding, ding. And suddenly, the story makes a little more sense. Because Andrea wasn't simply looking at Travis as a famous athlete. She was looking at him as a potential person in her daughter's life. And for a mother who had spent years watching Taylor navigate the extraordinary pressures of fame, that distinction matters. Taylor wasn't just any young woman dating another celebrity. She was one of the most recognizable people on earth. Anyone entering her life would automatically bring another layer of attention, another layer of pressure, another layer of scrutiny. So if Andrea was going to encourage Taylor to meet somebody, she needed to know what kind of person he was. And apparently, hearing that he was kind and deeply connected to his mother was enough to make Andrea think, okay, this could be interesting. But there was another problem. Taylor wasn't exactly sitting around waiting for an NFL player to enter her life. In fact, according to the conversation between Taylor and Andrea, Taylor had been very much non-athlete. And that makes the next part even more entertaining. Because Andrea apparently knew that her daughter might not immediately be excited about the idea. Taylor herself explained that she had never really been drawn toward athletes. She wasn't one. And her question was essentially, what would we even talk about? That's a pretty reasonable question. Taylor's world was music, songwriting, performance, production, lyrics, albums, art. Travis' world was football, playbooks, touchdowns, locker rooms, game plans, the NFL. They came from completely different professional environments, at least on the surface. But Andrea saw something Taylor didn't immediately see. Maybe the difference was exactly what made it interesting. And so Andrea made her move. Not aggressively. Not like some Hollywood manager arranging a publicity stunt. More like a mom calling her daughter and saying, I know you're probably not going to love this idea. But there's a guy. And he's really cute. Taylor has recalled the conversation with humor. Her mother, according to Taylor, had that particular tone of voice that basically announced, I'm about to suggest something you're probably going to resist. And then came the bigger message. You need to start doing something different. That line is important. Because Taylor's life at the time had been going through enormous change. Her personal life had been under a microscope. Her career was reaching historic heights. The Eras Tour was consuming enormous amounts of her time and energy. And she had just gone through painful relationship chapters. So the idea of doing something different wasn't necessarily about finding a football player. It was about being open to something she hadn't tried before. And that's where Andrea's influence becomes much more interesting. She wasn't telling Taylor, this is the man you're going to marry. She couldn't possibly have known that. She was simply saying, maybe give this one a chance. And sometimes, the biggest moments in life begin with something that sounds that small. Why Travis Emo mattered so much to Andrea. There's another detail in Andrea's story that deserves far more attention. It wasn't simply that Travis was nice. It wasn't simply that he was famous. It wasn't even simply that he was interested in Taylor. It was that Travis loved his mother. That detail apparently made Andrea immediately more comfortable with him. And when you know anything about the Swift family story, that makes perfect sense. Taylor's relationship with her parents has been an important part of her public journey. Andrea has been a constant presence through Taylor's rise from aspiring country singer to global superstar. She has watched her daughter experience the highs of fame and some of its most painful moments. She's seen the cost of being constantly watched. She's seen the criticism. She's seen the expectations. She's seen Taylor fall in love. She's seen Taylor get hurt. And she's seen her daughter become increasingly protective of her private life. So when someone new comes along, character matters. And apparently, Travis' relationship with his own mother was one of the first things Andrea noticed. There is something almost poetic about that. Because Travis wasn't just entering Taylor's world. He was eventually going to become connected to the Swift family. And one of the earliest bridges between those worlds may have been something as simple as two people caring deeply about their mothers. At the time, though, nobody knew where this was headed. Nobody knew whether Taylor would even agree to meet Travis. Nobody knew whether they would get along. Nobody knew whether the story would last longer than a few weeks. And certainly nobody knew that this would eventually become a marriage. But Andrea had another reason to be interested. She liked the way Travis had approached Taylor. Remember the friendship bracelet? He wasn't showing up with some extravagant celebrity gesture. He brought something connected to Taylor's own world. Something her fans understood. Something personal to the culture she had built. A friendship bracelet. Andrea later described that gesture as earnest. And that word may be one of the most revealing parts of the entire story. Earnest. Not calculated. Not flashy. Not artificial. Earnest. He had come to her show. He had brought something from her world. And, in Andrea's eyes, that said something about him. It suggested that he wasn't simply interested in Taylor Swift, the global superstar. He was interested enough to understand something about Taylor Swift, the person and the artist. That distinction mattered. Because Taylor had spent years dealing with people who wanted something from her. Attention. Access. Status. A connection to her fame. So perhaps what made Travis stand out wasn't simply who he was. It was how naturally he entered her world. He didn't expect Taylor to abandon her life and enter his. He was willing to learn hers. And eventually, Taylor would do the same. Taylor wasn't convinced at first. This is the part of the story that makes the whole thing feel more human. Because it would be easy to look backward and assume everything was inevitable. Taylor and Travis are together. They've built a life together. They've shared major public moments. And now they're married. So it can feel like the story was always heading there. But it wasn't. At the beginning, Taylor was hesitant. And honestly, that hesitation makes the eventual relationship even more meaningful. Taylor wasn't looking at Travis and immediately thinking, "That's my future husband." She was asking, "What would we talk about?" That's not the question of someone swept away by instant fantasy. That's the question of someone who genuinely doesn't know whether two very different worlds can work. And maybe that's why Andrea's advice was so important. She wasn't promising Taylor that everything would work. She was encouraging her to try something different. That distinction matters. Because sometimes people don't need someone to tell them what the future will be. They just need someone they trust to say, "Give it a chance. See what happens." And Taylor did. Eventually, she reached out. And from there, the story moved quietly for a while. This is another part fans sometimes forget. The public didn't see the beginning. Taylor later explained that she and Travis had already spent meaningful time getting to know each other before the famous football game appearance that made their relationship visible to millions. That means the moment the world thought it was witnessing the beginning wasn't actually the beginning. It was the beginning of the public chapter. The private chapter had already started. And that may have been one of the smartest decisions they made. They got time. Time to talk. Time to figure each other out. Time to discover whether the attraction was real. Time to discover whether their personalities worked. Time to see whether the differences between them were obstacles or advantages. And eventually, Taylor discovered something she may not have expected. Football wasn't the barrier she thought it would be. In fact, Travis could explain it to her in a way that made sense. Taylor later described his explanation of football in a memorable way, as something like high-speed, angry chess. And suddenly, two completely different worlds weren't quite so different anymore. Because beneath the football and the music, both Taylor and Travis understood competition. Preparation. Performance. Pressure. Public expectations. Failure. Success. And the need to keep showing up. Their jobs looked completely different. But the mindset required to survive at the highest level wasn't necessarily that different. And perhaps that was one of the things Andrea sensed before Taylor did. The detail that makes the whole story feel different. There is something fascinating about the fact that Andrea Swift didn't just say, "He's famous." She didn't say, "He's a star." She didn't say, "He's successful." She didn't say, "Everyone likes him." She focused on character. "He loves his mom." That was the detail that made Andrea's reaction change. And now, looking at everything that came afterward, that detail almost feels like the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Because Taylor and Travis didn't simply become a celebrity power couple. Their families became part of the story. Their parents became familiar faces. Their siblings became part of the broader picture. The relationship crossed between Taylor's world and Travis' world. Music and football. Concerts and stadiums. Swifties and NFL fans. And instead of one person completely disappearing into the other's world, both seemed to make room for the other. That was one of the reasons the relationship became so fascinating to the public. Taylor attended football games. Travis entered Taylor's concert world. He learned about her career. She learned more about his. And over time, the relationship began to look less like two celebrities dating and more like two people figuring out how to build a shared life while living under extraordinary attention. That is why Andrea's original instinct is so interesting. She didn't know any of that would happen. She didn't know Taylor and Travis would eventually become one of the most recognizable couples in entertainment. She didn't know they would eventually marry. She only knew that her daughter had spent years living inside an incredibly unusual world. And here was someone who seemed to genuinely appreciate her. Someone who made an effort. Someone who was comfortable with his own world. Someone who loved his family. And someone who wasn't intimidated by Taylor's fame. That last part may have mattered more than people realize. Because Taylor's fame isn't ordinary. Dating Taylor Swift means dating someone whose every move can become international news. It means cameras. It means headlines. It means people analyzing body language. It means fans discussing outfits. It means strangers dissecting facial expressions. It means every public appearance becoming a potential viral moment. For a relationship to survive that kind of pressure, both people need an unusually strong sense of self. And Travis appeared to have one. He had his own career, his own identity, his own family, his own world. And instead of competing with Taylor's fame, he could step into it without appearing to need it. That balance became one of the defining characteristics of their public relationship. And perhaps Andrea saw a hint of that from the very beginning. The Cupid revelation finally makes sense. For a long time, fans had wondered about something Travis himself had hinted at. Someone in Taylor's world had apparently been helping make the connection happen. Travis had previously suggested that there had been someone playing Cupid. But the identity of that person wasn't immediately clear. Was it a friend? A mutual acquaintance? Someone from Taylor's team? Someone from the music industry? Someone from the NFL? Swifties had theories. And then came the revelation. Andrea, Taylor's mom. Suddenly, a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The person who had apparently been nudging the story forward wasn't some mysterious industry insider. It was someone much closer. Someone who had known Taylor her entire life. Someone who understood her personality. Someone who knew when she was skeptical. Someone who knew when she needed a push. And someone who apparently wasn't afraid to tell her daughter, maybe you should do something different. That makes the entire origin story feel almost ordinary. And that's what makes it so charming. Because beneath the celebrity headlines, this was basically a mom trying to convince her daughter to go on a date. The only difference was that the guy happened to be one of the biggest football stars in America. And the daughter happened to be Taylor Swift. But emotionally, it was still a mother saying, I think this guy seems nice. Give him a chance. And Taylor saying, I'm not so sure. That human element is probably why fans connected so strongly to the revelation. Because no matter how famous Taylor becomes, she is still someone's daughter. And Andrea is still her mom. What Taylor and Travis found in each other, the bigger question is what happened after Andrea's introduction. Because a mother's recommendation can open a door. It can't make two people fall in love. Taylor still had to decide whether she liked Travis. Travis still had to decide whether he liked Taylor. And both had to discover whether their lives could actually fit together. That's where the story stopped being Andrea's. It became Taylor and Travis. And something clearly worked. The relationship developed. They kept seeing each other. They gradually became more comfortable. Eventually, the public began seeing them together. And then the relationship exploded into the cultural mainstream. Suddenly, Taylor Swift wasn't just attending football games. She was becoming part of the NFL conversation. Travis wasn't simply an NFL tight end. He was now part of Taylor Swift's world. Every game became an event. Every interaction became a headline. Every family appearance became a discussion. But beneath all that noise was something much quieter. The two people at the center had already spent time together privately. They had already established something before the cameras fully arrived. And that may be one reason the relationship seemed capable of surviving the enormous attention that followed. It wasn't built entirely in public. The public simply arrived later. That's a crucial distinction. Because when a relationship starts under cameras, the pressure can become overwhelming. But if the foundation exists before the spotlight arrives, the couple has something real to protect. And Taylor has spoken about being grateful that they had that private period. They got to know each other without the entire world watching every conversation. That time mattered. And eventually, the private relationship became public. Then the world got to see the result. Once Taylor began appearing at Kansas City Chiefs games, the cultural reaction was enormous. Football fans noticed. Swifties noticed. Entertainment media noticed. Sports media noticed. People who had never cared about either world suddenly found themselves following both. But there was something especially fascinating about watching Taylor in Travis' environment. She wasn't pretending to be a football expert. She was learning. And Travis wasn't pretending to be a pop music insider. He was learning too. That mutual curiosity became part of their appeal. Taylor could cheer for Travis. Travis could celebrate Taylor. And both could remain fully themselves. That matters because celebrity relationships often become stories about compromise. Who sacrificed more? Who changed? Who moved? Who gave up something? But with Taylor and Travis, much of the public narrative became about expansion. Taylor's world got bigger. Travis' world got bigger. Their families became connected. Their fans overlapped. And suddenly, a friendship bracelet had turned into something nobody could have predicted. A football player trying to meet a singer. A singer initially unsure whether she wanted to meet a football player. A mother doing some research. A cousin offering a recommendation. A daughter taking a chance. And then everything changed. Why Andrea's role feels so important now? If this story had ended after a few dates, Andrea's role would simply be a cute behind-the-scenes anecdote. But it didn't end there. The relationship continued. It became one of the most visible romances in the world. And ultimately, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce married in 2026. People.com. That changes the emotional meaning of the original story. Because Andrea wasn't simply encouraging Taylor to meet someone. She was unknowingly helping open the door to a relationship that would become permanent. And suddenly that little conversation about a friendship bracelet feels almost like the first scene of a much larger movie. Andrea scrolling through headlines. Andrea asking her cousin about Travis. Andrea hearing, "He's really nice. He really loves his mom." Andrea thinking, "Ding, ding, ding." And then asking, "How am I going to get her to meet him?" She couldn't have known the answer. But somehow, Taylor eventually did meet him. And the rest became history. That's the part that makes the story so emotional. Life-changing moments rarely announce themselves as life-changing moments. Nobody knows when they're standing at the beginning of something enormous. A casual phone call can become the start of a marriage. A missed backstage meeting can become a relationship. A friendship bracelet can become a symbol. A mother's suggestion can become the first step into an entirely new chapter. And that's exactly what happened here. The mother who knew her daughter better than anyone. There is one final layer to Andrea's role that makes this story especially meaningful. Andrea knew Taylor. Not Taylor Swift the superstar. Taylor the daughter. Taylor, the person who had spent years navigating impossible levels of fame. Taylor, who had experienced public heartbreak. Taylor, who had learned to protect her private life. Taylor, who had become increasingly careful about who she allowed into her inner circle. So when Andrea encouraged her to take a chance on Travis, she wasn't simply recommending a man. She was encouraging her daughter to step outside a familiar pattern. And Taylor later acknowledged that. The idea was essentially, you have to start doing something different. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to hear. Especially after you've been hurt. Especially when your life is already overwhelming. Especially when the idea of opening yourself up to somebody new feels exhausting. But Taylor did something different. And that decision changed everything. It didn't erase her past. It didn't magically solve every problem. It didn't guarantee a perfect future. But it opened the door to something new. And perhaps that's the deeper story here. Not that Andrea Swift somehow engineered a romance. She didn't. She couldn't. What she did was recognize an opportunity. She saw something she liked. She asked questions. She trusted someone else's opinion. She encouraged Taylor. And then she let Taylor make the decision herself. That is very different from controlling someone's life. It's support. It's guidance. It's a mother saying, I see something here. Maybe you should take a look. And Taylor did. The detail Swifties may never forget years from now. People will remember the stadiums. They'll remember the Eras tour. They'll remember the football games. They'll remember the outfits. They'll remember the viral moments. They'll remember Taylor and Travis walking together. They'll remember the headlines. They'll remember the wedding. But somewhere underneath all of that is a much smaller story. A story about a mother, a daughter, a football player, and a friendship bracelet. That is what makes it so memorable. Because the beginning wasn't glamorous. It wasn't some perfectly scripted Hollywood scene. It was Andrea Swift looking at the headlines and wondering, who is this guy? Then calling her cousin. Then hearing something she liked. He loves his mom. And suddenly, Andrea was interested. Taylor was skeptical. But eventually, Taylor took the chance. And that tiny decision became part of the story that changed her life. That's the part fans should remember. Not because Andrea created the relationship, but because she encouraged Taylor to be open to a possibility she might otherwise have dismissed. And sometimes that's what family does. They don't choose your future. They simply help you notice a door you hadn't considered opening. Taylor walked through that door herself. The end of an era, and the beginning of something else. It's almost fitting that this revelation came during a project focused on the end of the Eras tour. Because the Eras tour represented so much of Taylor's life. Her past. Her music. Her memories. Her heartbreaks. Her victories. Her reinventions. Her evolution. And as Taylor looked back on that period, another story was quietly being revealed. The story of what was happening in her personal life while the biggest tour of her career was unfolding. That's why Andrea's confession lands differently. It's not just about Travis. It's about Taylor changing. It's about Taylor becoming willing to try something she hadn't tried before. It's about discovering that two people can come from completely different worlds and still understand each other. And it's about a family member who recognized that possibility before Taylor fully did. That makes Andrea's role one of the most unexpectedly sweet pieces of the entire Taylor-Travis timeline. Because in the end, the story wasn't about a mother arranging a perfect romance. It was about a mother encouraging her daughter to stay open. And Taylor chose to listen. The little moment that became a life-changing one. Think back to the beginning. A football player goes to a Taylor Swift concert. He wants to give her a friendship bracelet. He doesn't get to meet her. So he talks about it. The story reaches Taylor's family. Andrea sees the headlines. She becomes curious. She calls her cousin Robin. Robin tells her Travis is nice. And then she says something that immediately catches Andrea's attention. He really loves his mom. Ding, ding, ding. Andrea sees a green flag. Taylor isn't convinced. Her mom encourages her to try something different. Taylor eventually reaches out. And from there, a private relationship begins. Then the world finds out. The stadiums fill with cameras. The internet goes wild. Swifties become football fans. Football fans become Swifties. The two worlds collide. And somehow, through all the noise, the relationship keeps growing. Until eventually, the story that began with a friendship bracelet becomes a marriage. And suddenly, that tiny conversation between Andrea and Taylor doesn't feel tiny anymore. It feels like the opening scene of an entire new era. Because that's the strange thing about life. The biggest chapters don't always begin with fireworks. Sometimes they begin with your mom calling you and saying, "There's a guy." Sometimes they begin with a little curiosity. Sometimes they begin with taking a chance. And sometimes, years later, you look back and realize that the moment you almost ignored was the moment that changed everything. Andrea Swift couldn't have known where that first conversation would lead. Taylor couldn't have known. Travis couldn't have known. But they took the next step. And then another. And another. Until the story became something none of them could have predicted. So maybe the real lesson from this revelation isn't that Andrea Swift was some secret mastermind. Maybe it's much sweeter than that. She was a mom who saw something good in someone. She wanted her daughter to be happy. She encouraged her to step outside her comfort zone. And then she trusted Taylor to make her own decision. That decision became one of the most important decisions of Taylor's personal life. And for Swifties who have watched Taylor grow through every era, there is something incredibly moving about seeing that behind the world's biggest superstar is still a daughter listening to her mom. A daughter who wasn't sure. A mom who said, essentially, just give it a chance. And a story that eventually became so much bigger than either of them expected. Because Taylor Swift's life has always been divided into eras. Country Taylor. Fearless Taylor. Red Taylor. 1989 Taylor. Reputation Taylor. Lover Taylor. Folklore and Evermore Taylor. Midnight's Taylor. The Eras Tour Taylor. But perhaps one of the most meaningful things about this chapter is that it isn't defined only by an album. It isn't defined only by a tour. It isn't defined only by a career milestone. It's defined by something much more personal. Taylor allowed herself to try something different. And somewhere at the beginning of that decision was her mother. Andrea Swift. The unexpected matchmaker. The chief's expert's cousin call. The friendship bracelet. The "he loves his mom" green flag. And one little conversation that nobody realized would eventually become part of Taylor Swift's love story. And that's why this story matters. Because when you follow Taylor through all of her eras, the most beautiful moments aren't always the ones happening on stage. Sometimes they're happening quietly. Behind closed doors. In family conversations. In little decisions. In moments nobody thought would become history. And this one did. So if you're a Swiftie who wants to keep following every chapter, every twist, every emotional moment, and every detail that makes Taylor's journey so extraordinary, stay with Taylor Timeline. Because the headlines tell us what happened. But the little stories behind them, those are the moments that make the timeline worth remembering. And if Andrea Swift really was the person who gave this love story its first little push, then perhaps one of the sweetest parts of Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce's story is that it began not with fame, but with family. And maybe that's exactly why it lasted.